This is where you're supposed to say they ain't got any strong points.
Many of the animals that were supposedly descendants from each other aren't apparently related at all.
Darwin's theory is definitely pseudoscience at the most.
Yeah, I would agree.
All right, I'll say that, Joe.
And now, the Flaming Sword.
Hey, Joe. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well, Darren.
Guess who we have with us again?
Well, since I'm looking at him right now, it looks like we've got Carmine Hetrick back.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks, Joel, Darren.
And he's going to give us some great information today about intelligent design.
Woo! All right, folks. If you can remember, Joel and I had discussed intelligent design, I believe in podcast number 3. Carmine agreed to talk a little bit more about that. So I think where we'll start, Carmine, is why don't you tell us what is intelligent design?
Sure, Darren. The idea of intelligent design is a competing theory to Darwinism and the theory of evolution by random mutations preserved by natural selection. This idea that all the life forms that we see today came from some common ancestor. Intelligent design challenges that and proposes that the complexity of life that we see simply can't be explained by purely random mutations, even if they are preserved by some means like natural selection. Because of that, they propose that they were produced by an intelligent designer.
Now, is this considered a field of science?
It depends on who you ask. Many who are Darwinists and sympathetic to the theory of evolution, they label it as a pseudoscience, that it's a false science. It's religion posing as science. But it actually is based on empirical evidence and a scientific argument. And that basically boils down to life contains a lot of information. And information, we know, comes from intelligent minds. Therefore, we can deduce that life itself came from an intelligent mind.
Kind of one more follow-up on the scientific question. Are there quite a few scientists, and some of whom maybe aren't even Christians particularly, but are there more scientists that are embracing this view over time?
Oh, yes, more and more every day. The Discovery Institute actually has a list of scientists who have officially said they dissent from Darwin. It's their dissent from Darwin list, and you can go and check it out. And there are many, many scientists who've signed on to that list there, the scope of scientists, the number of educated people who are now saying they see problems with the idea of Darwinian evolution.
So how does it relate as far as the Bible's concerned? Is it biblical, or are we just looking at a scientific theory?
Right. Well, there are many scientists in the ID movement who are Christians. There are many who are not. They don't use the Bible as the basis for it. Questions that were addressed by the idea of creationism aren't addressed in the intelligent design movement. Questions like the age of the earth, the effects of sin, after the fall, how long did creation take, whether or not it was even God who was the one who created the universe. These are all addressed in creationism, classic creationism, but not directly by intelligent design.
Now, see, I like that. I think it's good because I like the fact that there's a scientific argument. Even though there's pushback and even though the establishment is going to push back, it still separates the two. And then you can take that scientific argument, and if it is arguing for a designer, then that's just the first phase of someone saying, okay, there's a designer. If that helps someone to search it further and it leads them to the Bible and it leads them to the Lord, then I'm all for it. I think it's great.
Yeah, let me just chime in on that for a minute, Darren. And for those who listen to our podcast, for some people, and I probably was one of them before I became a Christian, I didn't really realize there was scientific evidence for a creator. I kind of put science and reason in one category and faith in another category because that's kind of what I had been taught growing up, even as being someone who was part of church for a long time. So I think, and this just piggybacks, Darren, on what you just said as well, is that there are people out there that need that evidence and they're looking for that. And we have a faith that can provide that. And if intelligent design is an on-ramp towards that faith, then I'm all for it too. I think it's really important.
Amen, brother. Yep, that's great. All right, Carmine. So I think what you brought today is kind of leading off of that is 6 points that we're going to discuss as it concerns intelligent design. And so when you're ready, you can start with point number 1 and we'll roll.
Okay. Yeah. So the first point that I would bring up, and that what causes many people to even question the idea of Darwinian evolution, is the fossil record. And it turns out the fossil record really lacks evidence that there were intermediate forms of life, especially during what scientists know as the Cambrian period. There's this explosion, they call it the Cambrian explosion, of organisms, where we see a very sudden appearance of many, many new life forms with very distinct body plans, with no apparent ancestors to them. And if Darwinian evolution is true, we would expect to see very gradual transitions between different generations of organisms, and we just don't see that in the fossil record.
Well, that's pretty interesting. So just like you said, you'd expect there to be a gradual process. Is that what you're saying? You don't see that? It's all of a sudden there were just these new creatures?
That's correct. Yep.
Wow.
Especially during the Cambrian explosion. It was this isn't just like a handful of things we don't have an explanation for where they came from. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of creatures that seem to have no ancestry.
Wow.
Yes, and isn't it kind of a fact, at least from what we can tell with what Darwin had first published in his Origin of Species, that if he were alive today, he would push back against his own theory just based on that.
There are people that have suggested that that's true. Yep.
Well, I'm going to more than suggest it. But I guess from his own book, just from his own theory, based on what he expected the scientists to find, we could push back and say, well, if he was alive today, he would say that we haven't found it.
Right. And what they keep saying, and I think this is right, at least from my perspective, is, well, we're going to someday those transitional forms will appear. And that's kind of an easy thing to keep saying.
Yeah. All right, Carmine.
I was just going to say we can head on to the next point.
Oh,
Great.
Okay. All right. I'll say that, Joe. All right, Carmine.
There's always one. There's always one in the crowd.
Well, I'll let you take the next one, Joel, if you want. I don't want to leave you out. All right. All right, Carmine. Point number 2.
Okay, the second point I would bring up is that the laws and constants of physics in our universe are improbably fine-tuned to make life possible. Many scientists have mentioned that, and they don't have a good explanation for it. And this isn't just the intelligent design people saying this. There are many scientists who claim to be Darwinists who admit that the universe and the universal laws seem to be finely tuned, as if done by some intelligent being.
Yes. That's a strong argument that even in debates like William Lane Craig, which we brought up on this podcast, he uses that a lot. And that's because it's a good argument. It's a solid argument.
We actually talked about that a little bit in our other podcasts that we did. And one example I use sometimes is the idea of this huge, huge soundboard. And even if you don't have a background running sound, you'll get this example, and that the universe is so fine-tuned that if somebody kind of snuck into the sound booth and even tweaked just one of those dials, it wrecks everything. That's how fine-tuned it is.
Yeah, that's good. That was the same one, wasn't it, where we just talked about how if you move the sun a little bit further away, we all freeze to death, but if the sun's closer, we all burn up. And then from a intelligent design, as far as the movement now, that where the guys like Michael Behe, who we've discussed, that goes all the way down into the cell, where they're looking at that something had to have designed them. Is that kind of what you're seeing, Carmine, too, in your with what you researched?
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's certainly a part of the argument. This point here was specifically just about the laws and the constants in the universe, but even just the configuration of our solar system and just the way life happened to be, how life came about and where humans fall in that chain. It seems very significant that we're here and that we can detect these laws, and it's almost like the universe was expecting us to come at some point. I forget what scientist said that.
These laws themselves, these principles that even make life as we know it possible, had to have been designed by some intelligent designer. Is that the idea?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yes.
Wow. Well, since Darren was so kind to let me transition to the next point, Why don't we do that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so that brings us to the third point that I want to mention, and that is that Darwin's theory of evolution proposed that at some point we would be able to reconstruct the hierarchy of organisms from everything that we see today all the way back to the original singular life form that inhabited our planet. He referred to it as the tree of life, ironically playing off of a biblical figure there. But science actually hasn't been able to do that this tree of life is still kind of an enigma, and there are many conflicting views on where life actually came from. So that poses a significant problem to Darwin's theory.
But let me ask a question about that, because that's so interesting, Carmine. So what happens when you'd have to start with whatever life form and then trace it back to the original? What have scientists found when they're attempting to do that? Why doesn't it work?
First of all, there's the gaps that we mentioned from the first point. There was that the fossil record simply lacks these intermediate forms, and we can't tell exactly, where things came from. And sort of related to that is then you kind of have to fill in the gaps based on your perceptions of which animals are the most similar. And people can't seem to agree on which animals came from which. And even beyond that is with advances in biochemistry, they can actually tell that many of the animals that were supposedly descendants from each other aren't apparently related at all, or that they have distinctions are so vast that you simply can't account for it based on random mutation.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, Darren, I just had a quick question. Haven't you found some of the same difficulties with your family tree?
You talking to me?
That's not funny. That's not funny at all. Okay, I guess it was.
Point number 4, Carmine.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So point number 4. So far, science has yet to prove that genetic mutations can actually build complexity in the existing life forms that we see. It appears that genetic mutations do not build complexity at all, and they, in fact, break the processes in cells, that they actually make it so that cells are less fit for the environment that they're found in and less likely to survive.
Is that the idea of survival of the fittest is maybe a term that people have heard a lot, but in fact, in order for those mutations to take place, it actually doesn't work? Can you explain that a little bit again?
Yeah, well, survival of the fittest is, that's kind of where natural selection comes into play, that, these mutations happen randomly, and then nature selects the animals that survive with those features that randomly evolved. It selects them for survival so that they can continue perpetuating those random mutations. But whether that process exists or not, you still have to account for the randomness of the mutations and the fact that you're going to have a random mutation that is beneficial in the environment that exists at the time that it happened, that is going to be then selected as more fit than other organisms and be allowed to survive, whereas the other organisms won't. It's that science can't account for, the randomness building up complexity.
Yeah, that's good. All right, point number 5.
Point 5 is the idea that unguided and random chemical processes cannot produce complexity or meaningful information. And so that kind of takes the idea of order out of the equation. Is, some scientists say that DNA and cells, that the order that the amino acids and stuff fall in, that they could arrive at those things by a random process. But information goes beyond the order and suggests that there is actually something meaningful embedded in those sequences that you can't get just by a random process.
That's good. Every point here really kind of builds on each other. Just when you go back to the fine-tuning of the universe, that in itself was so strong. But as you mentioned all of these together, it just really builds a strong argument.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think a lot of people would think that, hearing this.
Joe, anything on that?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of a phrase. There's an author that I listen to read sometimes, and also listen to. He does a lot of shows, and he says that which is unmanaged usually becomes unmanageable. We can put that even in our own lives. You don't keep things clean. Nobody cleans them up for you. You don't manage your relationships. They don't work so well. And what I'm hearing you say, Carmine, I mean, and in fact, you've even used the word random quite a few times, is if I've got this right, in order for me to believe Darwin's theory of evolution, I have to believe that somehow all these things that were completely random, that no one's managed, somehow create order and laws and intelligence. And that just seems like that's really hard to believe.
Yep, that's correct. Yeah, it definitely is.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
Well, let's go on to the last point here.
Okay, so the last point that I would mention is related to the other points there about mutations and that, but this is more down at the chemical level before life even took on many of the forms that we see it today, a sort of proto-life, life prior to life. What did it look like? And scientists can't account for that. They can't really explain that. And it's not that they haven't tried. They've been able to produce some of the building blocks of life, but nothing even close to some of the more complex proteins and enzymes and DNA and RNA strands and some of the other elements of a cell. They still have no idea how to create those things or get them to work together to produce some sort of stable existence.
I'm just thinking there, Carmine, that you mentioned earlier that some people would see intelligent design as scientific and some people would see it as a pseudoscience. Is that correct?
That's right.
Well, I find it kind of ironic, I guess, that if part of science is able to reproduce some type of experiment over and over to get a certain result, and scientists that would believe in evolution don't even have a way to produce that, it seems like maybe Darwin's theory is definitely pseudoscience at the most.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think many people are coming to that same conclusion that if one of them isn't scientific, then the other isn't either, that they both fall into the same category. Just depends on which way you want to categorize them.
Yeah, because what you're getting there is the people who are saying pseudoscience on that side, that's what they're saying. But we can push back just as hard against them and say, no, you're the one who's practicing pseudoscience. I mean, it's just as easy as that.
Yeah, and I remember, just for a specific example of that, before we get into maybe a couple other pushbacks, is Richard Dawkins, who's a very well-known atheist. I saw him one time, and he's someone who's pretty comfortable mocking people who believe in God and even encouraging others to do that. And he was in this debate, and he actually said, I know the universe looks really designed, but it isn't. I thought, well, that's not a very good argument. He ended up saying that later in the same debate because the guy he was debating with was trying to kind of push him and get more specific. And Dawkins ended up saying that, well, maybe we didn't evolve from something like fish particularly, but we're cousins of fish. And I'm thinking, here's a guy that some people would consider one of the most intelligent on the planet, and he's told me that it looks designed, but it isn't, and that fish are cousins coming over for our family reunion soon. So I just had to throw that out there. People will go a really long ways to make their belief seem right without any evidence sometimes. So
yeah, I just have one word for that.
That's nuts. That's nuts. That's just nuts.
There's no other way to put it. Carmine, out of all 6 points that you just discussed, we know that there's pushbacks, and I know you did the research on that, but we've got time for one. Just looking at their side, and you're looking at it from our perspective, what would you say is their strongest point that they would push back against us, and then we'll close with our pushback against that, just to get an idea of what they say when we bring up these arguments?
Okay, their strongest point. All right, so let me think about this for a second.
This is where you're supposed to say they ain't got any strong points.
Okay, well, I can certainly do that. So in my opinion, they really don't have any strong points, okay? But I'd say if we had to pick one, I would say that the existence of transitional forms, despite the fact that the fossil record doesn't have a continuous line or obvious line of descent for some organisms, there are some forms that could arguably be transitional forms. They found things that look a lot like mammals that have scales on them instead of hairs, and certain lizards that actually have feathers on them. And I think that is something that isn't necessarily predicted by intelligent design or classic creationism, but it's something that you would maybe expect from an idea like Darwinian evolution.
Yeah, the pushback on that would be, we don't know if that just wasn't another animal, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Well, it isn't necessarily predicted. It's certainly interesting, that God could create animals that had features that we would normally attribute only to one particular class of animals.
Sure.
It still doesn't necessarily mean that they descended from one another. It's just God apparently has applied features that in a way that we haven't expected.
Doesn't what is it today, the duck-billed platypus which seems to have different parts in it that makes up different animals. And I know that's been used. So we see that even today. And then we also know that many animals, even the dinosaurs have went extinct. So we have no idea what existed before, except through we could see some of these in the fossil record. So you're correct. There really isn't, they haven't got any strong points, but I can see where they're trying to use that as evidence. But then we can just push right back and say, well, what I just said, that's your back and forth.
Right. That's correct.
Joel, anything as we close?
Yeah, a couple quick things. One is a book I'd like to recommend by John Lennox. It's called Has Science Buried God? John Lennox, Has Science Buried God? Maybe at least half the book, if not more, are just quotes from various scientists. Some are Christian, some are agnostic, some are atheists. But it's interesting to see how many of the atheists and the agnostics that are scientists that will acknowledge, boy, this thing sure looks designed, but they just will not believe it because they know that there's some accountability to them there. And that leads me to the last point, which is Psalm 14, verse 1 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And so sometimes people don't believe because of a lack of evidence, but it really is a heart issue.
Hallelujah!
All right, guys. Carmine, you've got a website. I'll put the link in the notes, but if you want to tell everyone the name there for us.
Sure. I have a website and a YouTube channel, both by the same name, Daniel Reloaded.
That is awesome. Thank you. Hope you come back again. Joel, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. You guys have a super swell time till the next time.
You two guys, great.
Thanks, folks.
She combs her hair as she looks in the mirror, prepares herself for the day ahead. To the well to get some water. You never know what a day will bring.
You've been listening to The Flaming Sword. Until next time, remember, love the sheep. Shoot the wolves.